In a previous video, I converted a box of Ironjaw brutes into a warband themed around looting Stormcast armor and weapons. It was a ton of fun, but obviously it was missing a few key elements to be a true Ironjaw's warband, namely a Gore grunter rider and Megaboss. I started my Gore grunter by carving off a little of the boar's shoulders. Usually they're covered by armor plates, but I knew I'd be replacing them with looted Stormcast parts. This is the chest plate to a Stormcast Dracoth. The original Gore grunter doesn't have much of a dedicated saddle, but I wanted to add as much reused Stormcast plate as possible, and this one fit relatively well as the back of one. It was a touch too wide though, so I snipped it down before gluing. This is another Dracoth armor plate. Well, I thought about positioning it lengthwise to replace the armor plates already there. Unlike a lot of my conversions where I'm making one faction's units look like it's originally another's, my Ironjaws were explicitly just layering Stormcast armor and trophies over their own armor, so I simply glued it to the boar's flank. Another thought I had was to add the same armor plate I had earlier to the top of the boar. This actually makes a lot of sense in terms of real-world logic, but I ended up discarding the idea because it changed the silhouette too much. To replace the left shoulder armor, I used a Stormcast shield that actually fit really well. Like essentially all the Stormcast armor I used, it was already extremely weathered, as though it had been looted off a Stormcast that had been hacked to pieces. One of the fun parts about orcs is that they really don't need to look neat and tidy. So for the right shoulder, I decided to go asymmetrical and use yet another Dracoth armor plate. I also did this because while one Stormcast shield looks like a realistic reuse of Stormcast armor, two shields would feel a little memey. The Dracoth plate is a little small for the orc shoulder, so to fix it, and also give the Gore grunter a little more grunge, I harvested some chainmail and slid it under the armor plate, careful to angle it to look like it was trailing the Gore grunter's forward movement. The Gore grunter was looking a little plain, so I scraped clean the top of the Stormcast shield. This is the spike from an ogre gut plate. Just as I had with one of the shields of my Stormcast brutes, I glued it and the accompanying two to the shield of the Gore grunter. I did the same to the Dracoth plate on the other side. I really love the silhouette this gives the Gore grunter and just how disrespectful it feels. For the rider himself, I went minimalist with the Stormcast elements. I glued a Stormcast dagger to his lower back and a single half-shattered armor plate to his shoulder as a pauldron. I thought for a minute about replacing the tusk blades the Gore grunter originally comes with some Stormcast swords, but that just felt a little silly, so I used some plain old tusks instead. For the Megaboss, I started by attaching the armor plates and parchment scroll thing from the Praetor kit to my Megaboss's waist. Like with my original brutes, I'd found that the Stormcast elements looked best when they came off less like my brutes were kleptomaniac armor hermit crabs, and more like the Stormcast armor were trophies. These Praetor plates fit that niche nicely, though I later ended up having to adjust them down because they were making the silhouette of my Megaboss look a bit tubby around the middle. These are the pauldrons to the newer Stormstrike armor. They're significantly smaller than the older, chunky Stormcast pauldrons that I hate, and fit the Megaboss well as elbow guards. In general, I like the new Stormcast armor better than the old, but for my Megaboss I'm using a mix of the two, just so long as the specific armor bit reads immediately as Stormcast. This is a piece of terrain from the Steelheart Champion's kit. It's supposed to be rubble from a fallen statue, but there's no reason it couldn't be painted to look like metal. I dry fitted it to my Megaboss's pauldron to see how it would work. I was originally going to put it on the right pauldron to replace the ginormous drake skull that goes there, but the way the face is angled means most of it isn't visible from the front, so I shifted it to the left shoulder. I shaved down the surface of the pauldron so the head would fit better, then glued the blue face to it. While I could have left it like this, I wanted to really embrace the grunge and grit of the Ironjaws, so I took a length of chain and, just as I had in my brute video, used it to strap the face to the pauldron. While I could have drilled specific holes into the face to attach the chain, I decided to repurpose the eye sockets as anchors. There's something wonderfully disrespectful and Ironjaws about it. I hadn't been particularly careful in snipping off the dragon skull from the other shoulder, so to fit the gap, I repurposed a pauldron from the Maw Crusher kit to cover it up. It looked pretty good, though it didn't actually need to since most of it would be covered with this jagged half of a Stormcast shield. This is pretty cool on its own, but to take it to the next level, I gathered a few Stormcast masks and glued them one by one to the shield until I had 3 in a row like a trophy rack. They stick out a little too much, and later I would shave down the back of the head so they fit flusher. Instead of going the chain route as I had with the other side to show how they were attached, for my Megaboss's trophy rack, I drilled holes in the Stormcast helms, then glued in a paperclip wire as though the helms had been stabbed onto spikes. As another trophy, I took this sheathed axe and glued it to the waist of my Megaboss. It would be hard to draw from this position, but that's part of what makes it look like a trophy. Over the forearms of my Megaboss, I glued in large Stormcast armor plates. In general, I shied away from using enlarged bits like this on my Megaboss because it messes with the model's sense of scale. We all instinctively know what size Stormcasts are, so enlarging the armor would just make the Megaboss feel smaller. I mention this now because it made choosing a weapon for my Megaboss tough. Obviously, I wanted some kind of repurposed Stormcast weapon, but none of the ones I dry fitted were anywhere near large enough to replace his original axe adequately. I really liked the idea of him wielding a massive and notched greatsword, but the largest Stormcast sword is barely a toothpick in his hands. I also liked this axe hammer combo, but again it was too small. So loath as I was, I enlarged it through molding and casting until it was a more appropriate size. To try and vandalize the axe and make it more Ironjaw's flavored, I started by harvesting these teeth bits from another Ironjaw's weapon. They're usually just nailed onto the edge of an already existent blade, so I thought they made sense to add to the Stormcast hammer. As you can see, they're flat on one side, so I used green stuff to sculpt them to be more symmetrical. The 3 teeth felt like a little too much, so I took off the center one and replaced it with a pair of slashes to break up the pristine edge of the axe. To the hammer end, I glopped on green stuff and started sculpting it into peaks, much like I had with one of my Storm Brutes' hammer. While all of these were good ideas, the end product was too busy, so I went back to a plain axe head. Once attached, it looked good, but not great. It was just a little too conventional, and I found myself drifting back to the notched greatsword idea. What I eventually came up with to enlarge the sword was to cut a blade of the thinnest plastic card I had, then scrape clean the side of one of the enlarged swords so it could lie flat against the plastic card. I glued it to the plastic card on one side, then did the same to the other. I used a paper clip as a tag to pin it to the fist of the Megaboss, then used clay to fill the gap between the edge of the plastic card and the highest point of the original sword. I replaced the clay with green stuff later and gave the sword a Stormcast tilt. It's now far too large to have ever actually been wielded by a real Stormcast, but let's pretend my Megaboss looted it from some large metal statue of Sigmar when he was plundering one of their temples. I also replaced the comet sigil on my Megaboss's gauntlets with jaw sigils originally designed for orcs. I felt like it added a nice flair of the Megaboss making the armor his own. And with that, my Gore, grunter, and Megaboss were ready for battle. My Stormcast looting brutes wouldn't follow any but the strongest Megaboss, one who has triumphed again and again in battle against the hated Stormcast, and I think my Megaboss earns that name. I'm really pleased with how he turned out, and especially glad I was able to make the sword work, as I think it gives the model a really great flair. More so even than the brutes, I feel like he has a good mix of Ironjaw and Stormcast elements, and the Stormcast elements look clearly like trophies and not like he's just a kleptomaniac. Just as much as I'm pleased with my Megaboss, I'm happy with how the Gore grunter came out. He's a simple design, but one that really sells the idea. He feels fast and angular, and like he could shatter his shield line with his charge. I've got a few more Stormcast Megabosses in the works, where I kind of went a little insane with them, so subscribe to the channel if you want to see those when they come out. Until then, hit the like button or check out some of my other videos. Thanks for watching.